And welcome back. We're going to be covering today in the sections implementing Windows as part of the configuring Windows 10 solution. So in this section, we really are diving into understanding how to implement Windows. And if we were to take a look at sort of what's required when we're implementing Windows, this section really covers the installation requirements. Things like determining the hardware that you need to have, choosing between whether you're going to do a clean install versus an upgrade process, and then also talking about a number of different requirements that are within the actual platform, whether you're going to use Cortana, Miracast, and a number of other solutions.
Right, and a lot of this has to do with which version of Windows you'll be installing. We'll get to that video in a little while as well. And the installation requirements, as you said, with hardware. If you'll be using Hyper-V as an example, you may need different processor, different hardware than if you're not using Hyper-V.
Exactly.
So it all ties in together.
So as we go into it, the first section we want to think about is the hardware requirements. Now, Windows 10 really is probably the best and most utilized operating system, hopefully soon, that we can have available. The important thing to remember about Windows 10 is that it still has its specs, its requirements, and we've kept it at a minimum, just like we've done with the other operating systems. The important things that we've listed out here are things to remember for the exam. For example, the processor requirements at the minimum is a 1 gigahertz or faster processor that you need to have running, as well as a 1 gigabyte memory or RAM.
And again, there's things that we don't list there with the processor. If you're using Hyper-V, you need to make sure it's a virtualization-enabled processor, and things like that you want to consider as well. But yeah, the RAM, 1 gig or 2 gig if it's 64-bit Windows, and you know, the hard disk space, make sure you have enough hard disk space. And again, if you're using Hyper-V, and I'll keep going back to that, you may need more disk space to host those VMs.
We also mentioned the use of DirectX 9 for later versions of display drivers. So make sure that you're also running using that, the WDDM as well. That's also a requirement. And lastly, just having a display resolution of about 806 by 600. So if you have a device that you're looking to test out or install Windows 10, those are some of the prerequisites. In other words, if you were to install it on anything less, or if they ask you questions about installing it on anything less, it will be a less than optimal experience. So from a support standpoint, that's what we look for.
Right, exactly.
The other things to be aware of is just the hardware compatibilities. Now, Microsoft has a tool called the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. Now, the importance of this tool is it basically allows you to do some level of analysis or discovery within your organization in terms of whether or not you are ready to upgrade to Windows 10. So it does things like discovering the versions of Internet Explorer that's running, whether you're running the number of Windows 10 machines out there, if they're running specific software or hardware that that
applications, the versions, the ISV of the vendor. Yeah, we know that they're running Adobe, but which version of Adobe Reader are they running, and is that compatible? So the Map Toolkit actually allows you to schedule the scans. It's agentless. You push it out. You push the query from the server, and it just uses a WMI on all the workstations, reports back. So that's, again, the Map Toolkit. It's free to download at Microsoft.com.
Yeah, and it really is just there to determine your readiness to move to Windows 10. So from a hardware compatibility standpoint, and if you get any questions around the Map Toolkit or readiness, that's one of the things you want to consider. Understand the difference between what the Map Toolkit provides, and Joe, what the upgrade analysis
upgrade readiness. So they actually, that's actually a good time to bring this up. Things are moving very fast in Redmond, right? Windows 10 is updating a lot. And one of the things that we've updated is the name of our upgrade readiness. So it used to be called Upgrade Analytics, and now it's Upgrade Readiness. And that's an online, it's hosted in Azure, but it doesn't use your own Azure tenant. So it's kind of free. And we say free like a puppy is free. The puppy is free, but you still have to go to the vet, you still have to get it shot, still have to get it at home, and all that stuff.
Oh, so it's not really free. But
the puppy is free, right? So in this case, Upgrade Analytics, Upgrade Readiness is free. But what's not free is it's hosted as part of the OMS, or Operations Management Suite subscription. That's a subscription-based, and it's hosted up in Azure. So what that does is that does have an agent on the client machines, and you schedule scans on that as well, and it pushes it up to the cloud. Now, the nice thing about that is we have data from hundreds of millions of machines running Windows 10 already. in running some of this software. So we know if it's compatible, and we also have data from the ISVs. So the Symantics and Adobe's and Oracle's, they come to us and say, yes, this is supported on Windows 10 version 1607, version 1703, et cetera. So we have all that hosted up there in the OMS subscriptions as well.
So I remember there used to be a tool called the Application Compatibility Toolkit. Now, if I'm in the exam and I get a question around MAP, Toolkit, the Application Compatibility Toolkit, and the upgrade readiness, as you just mentioned, like how do I make a decision?
Right, so that's a good question, and they are different, right? Application Compatibility Toolkit allows you to create shims or fixes to applications that aren't compatible, and they're not compatible for one reason or another. It could be a user account control compatibility issue or some other kind of coding issue, and and so that allows you to create a shim and then put that in there. What the upgrade readiness does, it doesn't create any shims. What it does, it just lets you know what's compatible and what's not compatible. Allow you to say, okay, I have this grouping of computers that everything works on Windows 10. That's my low-hanging fruit. Let's push out the upgrades to those machines right now.
Excellent. So you still have three options when you're talking about deployments, and we wanted to make sure you understand what those options are as we go through this module with you. They have three options that we talk about is wipe and load, which is basically just starting from a new machine and just wiping it and starting with a new build. There's the in-place upgrade, which we'll also go over, and there's also provisioning. Now we've listed them out just high level here so you understand that there are those three options, but you have to make those decisions way early in the deployment of Windows 10.
Oh, absolutely. So, for example, a wipe and load versus in-place upgrade versus provisioning will determine whether or not you have to go to your OEM and say, hey, I need to order 1,000 machines or 10,000 machines.
So the first option is we have listed here is the wipe and load feature, which is basically, it's what enterprises are typically used to. It's basically out-of-box support for Windows 7 or Windows 8, Windows 8.1. You can just basically take a system, wipe it, start with a process of using some sort of user state migration tool, and reload it with a new image.
Right, it's a very common scenario on the exam. Why would I do a wipe and load? Because you're going to see in the next slide, we're going to tout the in-place upgrade. So why would I do a wipe and load? I would do a wipe and load for the exam if I'm going from Windows 7 x86 to Windows 10 x64. There's no in-place upgrade for that. So that would have to be a wipe and load. Or you just have a lot of old user profiles and a lot of old applications, and it just might be easier to start with a wipe and load. But typically for an exam purpose, you're going to go from x86 to x64, and that's why you're doing the wipe and load. Now, I said a little bit earlier, things are moving very fast in Redmond, and a lot of things are changing. So you're going to want to keep up with the technology of Windows 10 and with the exam specs, right? So as of the recording of this, Anniversary Update version 1607 is the current Branch for Business version of Windows 10 that's out. Coming up very soon is version 1703 that we're calling Creators Update. Creators Update has a way to do a legacy BIOS to the UEFI with the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface BIOS, so that the newfangled BIOS with all the new security features, it can do that during an in-place upgrade. Currently, right now, as we're recording this, that's not available. So a wipe and load might be to do a BIOS to UEFI conversion, but in future versions of Windows, you can do that with an in-place upgrade.
So for the exam, as you're preparing for scenarios like this, think about the challenges that you have in the enterprise when you're looking to do this upgrade and dealing with just the BIOS, the upgrade process, whether or not you're running on a BIOS system that needs to be converted to UEFI. This might be one of those questions where you have to understand that starting fresh with new machines might be the best option versus having to do just a basic upgrade process.
Or a wipe and load with an existing machine.
Exactly.
Right? Yep.
The tools to remember about this is that if you're doing a wipe and load, you're going to still need to use MDT, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, which we'll talk about later, as well as SCCM, which is the much more automated process and requires the enterprise software deployment tool to actually push out the actual update or migration of that system itself. The other area that we mentioned is the in-place upgrade, which is if I have a Windows 10 machine and it's running, if I have a Windows 7 machine or Windows 8 or 8.1 machine, I can actually look to upgrade that machine without having to do a complete wipe. What that means is my data stays intact, my personal files stay intact, and everything stays intact while it basically removes the existing operating system and updates it with the new operating system.
Everything stays exactly where it was on the hard drive, And if you're using SCCM and you've used BitLocker as your disk encryption, BitLocker will pause itself before the in-place upgrades. That's also nice. Also, for the exam purposes, a lot of us have had a lot of experience, multiple years experience with operating system upgrades. And so we, in our back of our minds, might have a bad muscle memory about operating system in-place upgrades because we've tried it from 2000 to XP or XP to 7 or Vista somewhere in between or 7 to 8 and didn't like the in-place upgrade process. So what we would end up doing is on the exam would say, well, I'm not doing an in-place upgrade because I wouldn't do an in-place upgrade. In Windows 10, we've made it a seamless process, and we've rewritten the way it works. And I say to a lot of my customers, we have proven that this in-place upgrade works because back in July 2015, we pushed out the upgrade to hundreds of millions of home users, and they all took it as an in-place upgrade, nearly 100% success. So the in-place upgrade does actually work better than it did in previous versions.
And the simplest thing to remember about the in-place upgrade, it might be just a simple command on the operating system. If you run setup.exe/auto-upgrade, you can actually upgrade to the latest version as long as you have the actual binaries for the Windows 10 image. And again, that can be automated through SCCM as well as part of the process. The third option you have is, let's just say you are a device provider, and you decide that you want your employees to basically purchase their device and then image it so that it meets the corporate standards. So provisioning, which isn't re-imaging, provisioning allows you to take a standard business device that's running whatever SKU you want. Let's just say Windows 10, it's running, a Pro or Enterprise, and provision it based on the provisioning packages so that you can basically have it install configurations on the OS that matches your organizational requirements.
Basically, the way it works is this. You say to your users, and we call this a choose your own device, or CYOD scenario. You say to your users, I want you to go to your favorite big box retail store and buy yourself a Windows 10 professional machine. Windows 10, doesn't matter as long as it's not Home Edition, Windows 10 professional machine. And when you first start it up, you're going to get to what we call UBI, or out-of-box experience. At that point, it's going to ask you for a provisioning package. Plug this USB into that device and point to the provisioning package. What will happen at that point, and we'll show you in a few minutes how you would create that provisioning package, but what would happen is the SKU would change to your enterprise key, it would change to your corporate volume license key, it would change to an enterprise SKU, and maybe enroll in an Intune or an MDM solution, mobile device management solution, possibly install applications after that. So the provisioning package is a very quick way to go to your favorite retail store, buy a Windows 10 professional machine, and then have it being managed by your company in under 30 minutes.
Right, and the simplicity of it is creating a provisioning package requires you to use the Windows Configuration Designer. And in the slide here, we kind of have a quick show of what the Windows Configuration Designer looks like. Here's where you'd install it using the Assessment and Deployment Kit. And once you have that installed, once you open it up, you can actually create a new project. In that process of creating a new project, you're basically going to decide that you're going to image or add specific drivers that are exclusive to that device that you're actually provisioning. And if we selected a certain set of drivers, we can actually do things like upgrade the production key, add additional components to that provisioning package. And all it is a bunch of settings that are going to be applied to your machine regardless of how it gets applied. It basically then takes on that persona for that machine itself.
And just another little interesting tidbit about this, because we keep talking about, or I keep talking about how fast things are moving. Right before we came out to record this video series, this was called the Windows Imaging Configuration Designer. So it was WICD, W-I-C-D, from being from Boston. I use the word wicked all the time.
Now it's really wicked.
So this was wicked, but they've decided in Redmond that very few people, and we know this from our telemetry, very few people are actually using the imaging portion of it, like under 2% that use WICD actually use the imaging, so they removed that capability. And so you'll see in the screen grab that we showed you that it still said Windows Imaging Configuration Designer, because it was literally a couple of weeks before we came out here to do this that they changed it to Windows Configuration Designer. You'll actually notice the executable is still called the either icd.exe or wicd.exe. The I is still in the executable name, but it's not in the tool name any longer.
And that's important to remember because when you're in the exam room, you might see WCDI, you might see WCD.
Exactly. You'd
right?
be like, what's WCD or what's WICD? It's the same tool right now.
Exactly. So you define the file itself, and at that point, that becomes an image or a package that you can basically distribute or provide to your end user so that they can actually plug it in via USB, run the package installation, and it actually configures the device as if it's being provisioned brand new. You can also do this with Windows 10 mobile devices as well, just to use that as a provisioning process and use that to do things like MDM joins and other things of that nature. So that's the third option. So we've mentioned those three.
And again, those, just as a reminder, those were the wipe and load, the in-place upgrade. Again, in-place upgrade, the beneficial is if you're going from x64 to x64. So Windows 7 x64 or Windows 8.1 x64 to Windows 10 x64. Do an in-place upgrade whenever possible.
Right. So for this portion of the exam, think about those three options. Now, that doesn't mean that that's all. Those are the only three options you have. They're tools that you have to have inside of those three options. One of the other tools that we'll want to mention is the Windows System and Image Manager, or WSIM. Never know how to say it correctly, but WSIM. You can actually create ANSI files or answer files that are the same set of configurations that you're expecting to install using the out-of-box experience or the UBI experience when you're actually imaging your device. So it works with MDT 2013 as well, and you can actually provide it as part of the Windows Deployment Services, which is another tool that you can use to deploy images, and you can actually add it to a USB as well.
Yep, if you add this to a USB, let's say you're doing just a local install of Windows 10 on your Windows 7 machine, you can just put this on a tangential file on a USB stick, and SETUP will automatically look for all drive letters, look for an auto unattend .xml, and automatically run it.
Okay, and then we talked about upgrades. And Joe, you want to mention?
Yeah, this is you see a lot of checkboxes and a lot of Ds and a lot of this. There's so many versions of Windows, from Windows 7, Windows 8, 8.1, Windows 10, and then minor additions inside of each one of those that I could spend an hour talking about what's supported as an upgrade. What you should know is it is supported to go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Pro, but Windows 8 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise. Know those upgrade paths. You see a couple of Ds in there. You can use what's called a downgrade right to go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Home if you wanted to with a downgrade right. But the exam's not going to test you on downgrade, but I did want to put that in there because it is a possibility. So again, know some of the common ones. The common ones will be Windows 7 Pro or Windows 8, 8.1 Pro. Where can you go to Windows 10 as doing even as an in-place upgrade?
So I can go from Windows 7 Pro, if I have one today, come in with the Windows 7 Pro machine, and I want to get to whatever my corporate environment has. I can go from Windows 10 Pro, Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise.
You can go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Pro. But again, let's talk about what's happening in the later versions of Windows. You can now actually, throughout this upgrade, you'll go from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Pro, change the license key, it automatically turns into an enterprise. So the upgrade will get you to Windows 10 Pro. Later on, another step in that upgrade might be to change the key to an enterprise key. But if you have Windows 8.1 Pro, that you can upgrade to Windows 10 Enterprise just as part of an in-place upgrade.
Okay, so it's Windows 8.1. So for the exam, just make sure you know the difference between when they're asking about Windows 7 Pro and Windows 8.1 Pro, which can actually go to Windows 10 Enterprise as well.
Yep, and again, that nice feature of Windows 10 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise, change the key, don't even reboot. Literally, you don't have to reboot. You have to in earlier versions of Windows 10, but later versions you do not need to reboot to switch from Pro to Enterprise.
Okay, so we talk also about USMT, User State Migration Tool. Again, another tool that you can use to take the user data, back it up in a specific location, and then do the upgrade, and then replace that user data back into the system itself, whether it be files, user profile information, documents, anything that you want to save or back up as part of the migration status. So USMT itself it also supports the Windows 10. It actually still uses the scan state, load state, as well as the migration XML files. So for the exam, make sure you know the difference between MIG docs, MIG apps, and MIG users. Okay, we'll be testing you on the knowledge of those three things. The other thing to keep in mind is, just that USMT also doesn't support, USMT 10 doesn't support earlier versions. So when you're working with Windows 10 or anything later, it's really there for migrating Windows 10 to Windows 10.
Yep, that's a good point. If you're going from Windows 7 to Windows 10, the scan state part of this that's running on the Windows 7 machine, we might have a slide coming up on this. The scan state part running on the Windows 7 machine has to use a version of USMT that's compatible with Windows 7, while the load state portion running on the Windows 10 machine runs the USMT for Windows 10.
Yeah, and this is because these two operating systems are built separately. They don't have the same, relative paths that you would have on each system. So each tool will account for the specific operating system, but in the end, you have to combine those tool sets of tools to make sure that you get the data back where you need it to.
For the exam, what you really need to know is, you need to know a couple of things. You need to know, as Alfred said, the MIG docs and MIG apps and MIG user XML files. You also need to know the difference between scan state and load state, which one is run when, and the whole order of operations. So the next slide we have coming up shows you that order of operations, right?
Yep, and so if we walk you through that process, if, for example, an admin launches the scan state tool.
And this could be an admin launching it if it's doing a manual upgrade for one machine. It also could be just the order that your task sequence is in SCCM as an example, right? Scan state runs first.
Right, and then the scan state reads that XML file and basically knows exactly what it needs to back up. And then what it does is it takes that information and collects the data and stores in a specific location so that it can actually be retrieved at whatever time you decide to do the load state. So at this point you have a stored location where you have a set of files that are supposed to be restored on the device itself. And
actually it's an encrypted file.
Exactly.
So no one actually has access to it. No one can open it up on the share or wherever you happen to load it to.
Yep, and then from there, once you've done all that work, you've upgraded the system, you've wiped the device, and now you're running Windows 10, you might want to take the load state for Windows 10 on the USMT side and start that same process again. So it then says, hey, I need to initiate a load state. So you run the command. It then goes and looks at that specific XML file. It says, these are the files that I need to restore back on that device. And from there, it says, okay, let me grab those files for you, use load state, and restore it on that device as a destination location. Now, the good thing about this, having it on a separate storage location in the USMT process, is that if for some reason you don't get the information back that you need, you can always go back and find it in that stored location.
And the other piece of that is if it's not stored in a network location and you're doing even a wipe and load from Windows 7 to Windows 10, you can have what we call hard links with USMT.
Yes.
So when the disk gets wiped in that wipe and load, these USMT marks these specific sectors, these specific files as don't wipe. Right, so you don't need any network access for this. You just do the hard link, scan it, hard link it, install the operating system, install the applications, and then load state looks for those hard links to restore all the data.
Yeah, and a little tidbit from many of you guys. If you think about what the in-place upgrade is doing, that is essentially how it's able to accomplish just that process of doing the in-place upgrade, because it uses the internal links to save the documents in a specific location and then restores it back when it's complete.
So this next slide we have, as we just said, there's different versions of USMT based on the operating system you're coming from and going to. So you can just see we put here, if you're coming from Windows XP, I should also note while that's on there, there's no in-place upgrade path from Windows XP. You'd have to go XP to 7, then 7 to 10. If you want to do it as an in-place upgrade, probably you'll do a wipe and load instead. That said, you'd have to use a really old version of USMT to get the scan state on the Windows XP machine.
If you want your data back, that is.
Same thing with Vista. There's no actual path to upgrade without going to Windows 7 or 8 or 8.1 first. Anyway, so you can see the versions available for those operating systems. Just make a mental note of that, just so you're aware. The main point here is that scan state for Windows 10 will not work on Windows 7.
And that's important to note. What Joe just mentioned is the fact that there are certain scenarios where you'll have to go from Windows XP to Windows 7 first, and then from Windows 7 to the next version update, or going from Windows 7 to Windows 8 or 8.1 and then moving to Windows 10. So just keep that in mind during the exam so that you know exactly what scenario they're looking for and what you're trying to accomplish by doing it.
Right.
The last slide is I have a practice question for you guys, and I'll go ahead and read that now. Your company's desktop runs 32-bit Windows 7 with Service Pack 1. You're planning the migration to 64-bit Windows 10. You've confirmed that all of the hardware is compatible with 64-bit Windows 10. The migration must meet the following requirements. User settings and files must be preserved during the migration. Existing hardware should be used. What's the best path for this migration?
You know, it's interesting that it's worded that way. What's the best path? Because you can always do a wipe and load. As long as you're using USMT, you can always do a wipe and load. So that's always an option for you.
What's the downside of wipe and load?
The downside of wipe and load is there's the possibility that you could lose data. In this case, you're going from 32-bit to 64 bits. That is really the only option between A, C, A and C, right? You can't do an in-place upgrade for that. So what you want to take a look at is, what's the bitness of the first operating system of the second one, and then you want to take a look at the other provisioning package. Provisioning package, we said you're not re-imaging anything in that case. You're going to a big box store and buying your own computer and then making it work with your company. In a side-by-side migration, that's definitely not the best path for anything. That's basically you get two machines for a little while. That's not any kind of migration. So the answer here is a wipe and load migration.
Wipe and load. So there you go, folks. I mean, the important thing to remember is when you're dealing with, just the preparing for going to Windows 10, think about things like what operating system I'm going with, what challenges I have moving from the existing platform to the newer platform, and whether or not I need to use specific tools like the USMT, the application compatibility toolkit, or any of those wiki tools that we've talked about. They're all there for you, and these are things you're going to be challenged on initially. So that kind of completes the first section, so hopefully you stay with us as we continue on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.